Part 1: The Ghost of a Better Man. The silence in a house is different when you are the one who emptied it. It isn't just a lack of sound. It's a heavy, suffocating pressure that pushes against your eardrums until you want to scream just to prove you still exist. I sat in the middle of our pristine, marble-counted kitchen, clutching a glass of wine that cost more than my first car. I had the career, I had the penthouse, I had the freedom I told myself I wanted 6 years ago. But I didn't have Mark. And as of tonight, I didn't even know if Mark was still breathing. Most people who cheat talk about a moment of passion, a lapse in judgment. For me, it was a slow, arrogant rot. I thought I was the sun and Mark was just a planet lucky enough to be in my orbit. I thought his kindness was weakness. I thought his steady, unwavering love was boring. So, I broke him. I broke us. I did it with a co-worker who didn't even remember my middle name 3 months after Mark packed his life into 2 suitcases and vanished into the rain. No goodbye. No, we can work this out. Just avoid where a man used to be. For 6 years, I tried to fill that void with bigger checks and faster crowds. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Not the face of the man who loved me, but the face of the man I destroyed. I needed to know. I needed to find him. Even if it was just to hear him tell me he hated me. That's why I called Elias Thorne. He wasn't just a private investigator. He was a hunter of people who didn't want to be found. When Elias walked into my office, he didn't look like a movie detective. He looked like an accountant who had seen too many autopsies. He tossed a thin folder on my desk. He told me that finding a man who wants to stay lost is like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. He told me it would be expensive. I told him I didn't care about the price. I cared about the truth. Be careful what you wish for, Sarah, he warned. His voice was like gravel under a boot. Some truths don't set you free. They just bury you deeper. I should have listened. The first few weeks were a blur of bank records and dead ends. Mark had erased himself. He'd shut down every account, sold his car for cash, and walked away from a 6-figure engineering career. It was as if he'd stepped off the edge of the earth. But Elias was patient. He followed a trail of breadcrumbs that started at a small town library 3 states away and ended in a coastal village where the fog never truly lifts. 10 days ago, Elias called. He found him. But his voice sounded different. There was a hesitation there that hadn't been there before. I found him, Sarah, but you need to understand something. The man I'm looking at, he isn't the man in the photos you gave me. Not even close. My heart hammered against my ribs. I boarded a flight that night. I didn't pack much, just enough to last me a few days and the gold watch I'd bought for our 10th anniversary, the anniversary we never got to celebrate. The village was a place of grey stone and cold salt air. It felt like the end of the world. Elias met me at a small tavern near the docks. He looked tired. He handed me a pair of binoculars and pointed toward a small, weathered shack perched on a cliffside, overlooking the churning Atlantic. He goes there every morning at 5 a.m., Elias whispered. He sits on that bench. He doesn't move for 3 hours. He just watches the horizon. I looked through the glass. My breath hitched. The man on the bench was thin. His hair, once thick and dark, was now a shock of silver. He moved with a limp I didn't recognize. He looked 70, though I knew he was only 42. He looked like a man who had been carved out by the wind until there was nothing left but bone and memory. I wanted to run to him. I wanted to fall at his feet and beg for a forgiveness I didn't deserve. But Elias grabbed my arm. His grip was like iron. Wait, he said, there's more. I did a deep dive into his medical records from 3 years ago. When he left you, he didn't just leave the city. He went into a spiral. He took jobs that no one else wanted. Dangerous jobs. High-altitude welding. Deep-sea salvage. It was like he was trying to find a way to let the world finish what you started. The guilt hit me like a physical blow. I had thought he would move on. I had thought he would find a nice girl and have the family I refused to give him. I never imagined that my betrayal had turned a vibrant man into a ghost seeking a grave. He had an accident, Elias continued, his eyes fixed on the man on the cliff. 2 years ago, a structural collapse on a rig. He survived, but he lost more than just his mobility. He lost his voice, Sarah, physical trauma to the larynx. He can't speak. I felt the world tilt. My husband, the man who used to read me poetry in the dark, the man whose voice was my only anchor, was trapped in a world of permanent silence. And it was my fault. If I hadn't sent him running into the dark, he never would have been on that rig. He would have been home. With me. I need to talk to him. I sobbed, the tears finally breaking through. You can't talk to a man who can't answer, Elias said, but you can listen. I managed to get something. Something he carries with him every single day. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, battered digital recorder. It was an old model, the kind Mark used to use for his engineering notes. I found this in his locker at the local shipyard where he does odd jobs. He thinks it's broken. It isn't. I fixed the lead, Sarah. This is the only thing he's said in 2 years. Elias pressed play. At first, there was only the sound of the wind. Static. The rhythmic thumping of waves against stone. And then, a sound that made my blood turn to ice. It wasn't a voice. It was a rhythmic tapping. Slow, deliberate. Tap, 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 tap. It's Morse code, Elias whispered. He records it every night before he sleeps. He thinks no one is listening. Do you want to know what it says? I nodded, unable to find my own voice. Elias looked at the transcript in his notebook. He looked at me with a pity that burned worse than his judgment. He repeats the same phrase, over and over, into the silence of that empty shack. He says, I am still waiting for the apology that will never come. So I can finally allow myself to die. The recorder kept playing. The tapping continued. It was a heartbeat, a ticking clock, a death sentence. I realized then that my mission wasn't about finding a husband. It was about witnessing a haunting. I had hired a pie to find a man, but all I found was the wreckage of a soul I had dismantled with my own hands. But as I watched Mark on that cliff, he did something he hadn't done in the 3 hours Elias had been watching him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. He smoothed it out on his knee with trembling fingers. Even from this distance, I recognized the color. It was the pale blue stationery I used for the only letter I ever wrote him, the one I left on the bed the day I told him I was leaving. The letter where I blamed him for my own unhappiness. He didn't throw it away. He didn't burn it. He pressed it to his lips. And then, he looked directly toward the tavern where we were hiding. Part 2, The Blueprint of a Broken Heart. The air in the tavern felt like lead. Mark's eyes remained fixed on the window where we sat. But there was no spark of recognition, only a hollow, haunting stare that seemed to pierce right through the glass and into the darkest corners of my conscience. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking through me, toward a past that no longer existed. He knows someone is watching, Elias muttered, his hand instinctively reaching for the binoculars. He's been looking at this tavern every day for a week. He's not waiting for you, Sarah. He's waiting for the end. I couldn't stay in the shadows anymore. The weight of the digital recorder in Elias's hand, with its rhythmic tapping of a dead man's hope, was too much to bear. I stood up, my chair screeching against the wooden floor like a cry of pain. I'm going out there, I said. My voice sounded thin, like brittle glass. Sarah, wait, Elias cautioned, standing up to follow. There is one more thing in the file. Something I didn't tell you back at the office. I wanted to be sure first. I stopped, my hand on the heavy brass handle of the tavern door. What else could there be? Elias, you've already shown me he's a ghost. You've shown me I killed him without a weapon. Elias stepped closer, his face shadowed by the dim light of the pub. I tracked his finances. You told me he walked away from everything. Right? No bank accounts, no investments, no traces of the millions he helped build for your firm. He did, I whispered. He left it all to me. Every cent. It was his way of saying he didn't want a single thing that had my touch on it. That's what the legal documents say, Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent hum. But that's not what happened to the money. He didn't leave it to you, Sarah. He redirected the dividends. Every month for the last 6 years. 90% of his remaining wealth has been flowing into a private trust. A trust called the Lullaby Foundation. I frowned. The name meant nothing to me. What is it? A charity? It's a specialized medical fund, Elias replied. It pays for the long-term care of a single patient in a private facility in Switzerland. A patient who was admitted the same week Mark disappeared. My mind raced. Mark didn't have family left. His parents had passed years before we met. He had no siblings. Who is the patient? Elias hesitated. He pulled a single, folded sheet of paper from his inner pocket. The patient is a woman. Her name is Elena Vance. Does that name ring a bell? I shook my head. No, I've never heard of her. She's a neurosurgeon, Elias said. Or she was, until 6 years ago, when she was involved in a massive car pile-up during a rainstorm. The same rainstorm the night Mark left your penthouse. The room began to spin. I remembered that night. The rain had been a deluge. A curtain of grey that blurred the world. I had been screaming at Mark, telling him he was stifling me, while the thunder drowned out his pleas for us to just sit down and talk. When he finally walked out, he hadn't just walked out on a marriage. He had driven into a nightmare. He wasn't just driving away from you, Sarah, Elias said softly. He was the first on the scene of that accident. He pulled Elena Vance from a burning wreck before the paramedics arrived. He saved her life, but he couldn't save her mind. She's been in a persistent vegetative state ever since. And Mark, he's been paying for every breath she takes. I gripped the doorframe so hard my knuckles turned white. Why would he dedicate his life to a stranger? Because, Elias said, looking out at the man on the cliff. He told the doctors that if he had stayed home 5 minutes longer, if he had fought for you for just 5 more minutes, he wouldn't have been on that road. He wouldn't have been there to save her. He believes her condition is the price of his freedom from you. He calls it his penance. He thinks he traded your love for her tragedy. I pushed the door open. The cold Atlantic wind slapped my face, smelling of salt and decay. I began to walk. The path up the cliff was treacherous, slick with moss and ancient spray. My designer boots were never meant for this terrain. But I didn't care. I stumbled, the sharp rocks cutting into my palms. But the physical pain was a mercy compared to the realization that Mark's entire existence was now a monument to a night I had instigated. As I reached the summit, the sound of the waves became a roar. Mark was sitting perfectly still. Up close, he looked even more fragile. The wind whipped his thin jacket against a frame that had once been broad and strong. I stopped 10 feet away. The silence between us was a physical wall. Mark, I whispered. He didn't turn. He didn't flinch. He just kept staring at the horizon. I took another step. Mark, it's me. It's Sarah. Slowly, painfully, he turned his head. His eyes were the color of the sea before a storm, cold, deep, and utterly exhausted. There was no anger in them. That was the part that broke me. Anger would have meant he still cared. Anger would have been a bridge. This was just nothing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small slate and a piece of chalk. His hands shook with a violent tremor. He wrote 3 words and held it up. Why now, Sarah? I couldn't stop thinking about you. I sobbed, falling to my knees in the dirt. I thought I wanted a different life. But I was wrong. I was so wrong. I tracked you down because I wanted to fix it. I wanted to bring you home. Mark looked at the slate. He wiped it clean with his sleeve, the chalk dust flying into the wind like grey ash. He began to write again. It took a long time. The screech of the chalk against the stone was the only sound besides the gulls. He held it up. I am home. The wreckage is my home. No, I cried. Elias told me about the trust. About Elena. Mark, you can't carry the weight of the world on your shoulders because of what happened that night. It wasn't your fault. I was the one who was cruel. I was the one who pushed you out that door. Mark stood up. It was a slow, agonizing process. He limped toward me, his shadow falling over my shaking form. He didn't touch me. He didn't offer a hand. He just stood there, looking down at the woman who had once been his whole world. He reached for the digital recorder that I had taken from Elias. I held it out to him, my hands trembling. He took it, but he didn't play it. Instead, he looked at the record button. He pressed it. He leaned down, his face inches from mine. He opened his mouth, and for a second, I thought he was going to scream. I thought the rage would finally find a voice. But only a harsh, wheezing sound came out, the sound of air passing through a ruined throat. He closed his eyes, took a ragged breath, and tapped a message onto the casing of the recorder with his fingernail. Tap, 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 tap. Then, he handed it back to me. He pointed toward the trail leading back to the village. He wasn't inviting me in. He was dismissing me. Mark, please, I begged. Let me help. Let me pay for the facility. Let me take you to a specialist. I have the money. I have the resources. He shook his head once. A sharp, definitive motion. He pointed again. Go. I turned and ran. I ran until my lungs burned. Until I reached the tavern where Elias was waiting with a look of grim expectation. I didn't say a word. I just sat in the car and stared at the digital recorder in my lap. What did he say? Elias asked quietly as he started the engine. I pressed the play button. The sound of the wind filled the car. Then, the tapping. It was different this time. It wasn't the message about waiting for an apology. It was shorter, sharper. Translate it, I whispered. Elias took a breath, his eyes fixed on the road. He didn't need a notebook this time. It's a single word, Sarah, over and over. What is it? Release. But it wasn't a request for me to release him. As I looked back at the cliff, I saw a flicker of orange light. Mark's small shack was beginning to glow. A thin ribbon of smoke rose into the morning sky. Mark wasn't asking for my help. He was clearing the site for his final project. Part 3. The Sanctuary of Silence. The smoke from the cliffside wasn't a cry for help, it was a cleansing. By the time the local fire brigade reached the shack, there was nothing left but scorched stone and the smell of burnt cedar. Mark was gone. He hadn't perished in the flames. Elias confirmed he'd been seen boarding a private transport an hour after I fled. He was moving, always moving, a ghost haunted by the living. He's headed to Switzerland, Elias said, his voice weary as he adjusted his glasses. The Lullaby Foundation, the facility called him, Elena Vance. Her vitals are dropping. After 6 years of stasis, the body finally decides when it's had enough of waiting. I didn't hesitate. I couldn't. If Mark was going to be there for the end of the woman he saved, I had to be there for the end of the man I destroyed. I paid for a private jet, a luxury Mark once mocked as soul-crushing vanity. Now, it was just a tool to chase a shadow across a continent. The clinic was a masterpiece of glass and light, nestled in the shadows of the Alps. It looked more like a cathedral than a hospital. When I arrived, the air was thin and bitingly cold. I found Elias waiting in the lobby, his face a mask of grim realization. He's in room 402, Elias whispered. But Sarah, you should know. He didn't just pay for her care. He's been the only visitor she's had in half a decade. Every holiday, every birthday, he sits there and reads to a woman who cannot hear him, with a voice he no longer has. I walked down the hallway, the sound of my heels echoing like gunshots against the polished floor. I reached room 402 and stopped. The door was cracked open. Inside, the room was filled with the soft, rhythmic wheeze of a ventilator. It was the only sound. Mark was sitting in a chair by the bed, his back to me. He was holding the hand of a woman whose skin was as pale as the sheets. Elena Vance. She looked peaceful, a sleeping beauty who would never wake up. Mark was leaning forward, his forehead resting against the mattress. He was shaking, not from a tremor, but from a grief so profound it seemed to vibrate the very air around him. I pushed the door open. He didn't look up. He knew it was me. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words feeling hollow and pathetic in the presence of such devotion. "I'm so sorry for everything." Mark slowly sat up. He didn't reach for his slate this time. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. He flipped to a page near the end and held it up. The handwriting was jagged, written in a hurry. "You think this is about you?" The words hit me like a physical punch. "I know I caused this," I stammered. "If I hadn't been so selfish. If I hadn't cheated." Mark stood up, his movements fluid despite his limp. He walked toward me, and for the first time, I saw the true depth of his transformation. His eyes weren't just sad, they were clear. The fog of the cliffside was gone. He looked at me, and I realized with a sickening jolt that he wasn't looking at a monster. He was looking at a stranger. He pointed to the woman in the bed. Then he pointed to the digital recorder I still gripped in my hand, the one Elias had fixed. He gestured for me to give it to him. I handed it over. Mark didn't record a new message. He pressed a sequence of buttons I hadn't noticed before, a hidden archive. He held the speaker to my ear. A voice came out. It wasn't the tapping of Morse code. It wasn't the wheezing of a broken throat. It was Mark's voice from 6 years ago. Rich, warm, the voice I had fallen in love with before I grew bored of its kindness. "Sarah, if you're listening to this, it means I finally found the courage to leave. Not because of the cheating. I could have forgiven that. I would have fought for us until my last breath if it was just a mistake." I froze. The recording continued, his past self speaking to my present ghost. "But it wasn't a mistake, was it? I saw the way you looked at me for months. You didn't hate me, you were indifferent. I was just a piece of furniture in the life you were building for yourself. I left that night because I realized that staying with you was a slow suicide. I chose the rain because at least the rain felt something." The recording clicked. Silence. Mark took the recorder back and placed it on the bedside table next to Elena. He picked up his pen and wrote one final note in his journal. He ripped the page out and handed it to me. "The pie didn't find me. Sarah, I led him to you." My breath caught. "What?" "I knew you would look. I knew your guilt would eventually turn into a project. You love projects, Sarah. You love fixing things once they're irreparably broken." I looked at the paper, then at him. He wasn't the victim I thought he was. He was the architect of this entire encounter. "I needed you to see this. I needed you to see Elena. Because she is the only person in the world who actually heard me. When I pulled her from that car, she looked at me with more genuine connection in 3 seconds of agony than you did in 10 years of marriage. Mark, please." He held up his hand. Silencing me, he pointed to the monitor. Elena's heart rate was slowing. The end was minutes away. "Go home, Sarah. Enjoy your penthouse. Enjoy your career. Enjoy the silence. Because from this moment on, I am no longer the man you broke. I am the man who survived you." He turned back to the bed. He took Elena's hand and leaned in close, his lips moving against her ear. No sound came out, but I knew what he was doing. He was telling her it was okay to go. He was giving her the release he had tapped out on the recorder. I backed out of the room, my legs feeling like they were made of water. I walked through the glass halls, past the silent nurses, and out into the biting Swiss air. Elias was waiting by the car. He looked at my face and didn't ask a single question. He just opened the door. "Where to, Sarah?" I looked up at the mountains. at the vast, uncaring beauty of the world. I thought about the 5,000 words I could write about this. I thought about the scripts, the content, the way I could package this grief into something viral. And then, I felt it, the break he promised. It wasn't a broken heart. It was a broken ego. I realized that Mark hadn't been waiting for an apology so he could die. He had been waiting for me to witness his life so he could finally live. He had used my own narcissism to lead me across the world just to show me that I was the one who was truly alone. Take me to the airport, Elias, I said. My voice was steady, but it felt hollow. And the man, the PI report? Close the file, I said. There's nothing left to find. As the car pulled away, I looked back at the top floor of the clinic. A single light flickered and went out. Mark was free, and for the first time in 6 years. So was I. But as the silence of the car settled around me, I realized that freedom was the most terrifying thing I had ever felt. Because in the silence, there was no one left to blame but myself. I opened my phone and looked at the draft of the script I had been writing in my head. I highlighted all 5,000 words. I hit delete. Part 4, The Sound of a Life Unlived, The Coda. 1 year later. The penthouse in Manhattan was gone. I sold the marble, the glass, and the view of a city that never stops talking. I moved to a small, quiet house in a coastal town not unlike the one where Elias found Mark. I didn't do it for him. I didn't do it to imitate his suffering. I did it because I finally realized that the noise of my old life was just a frantic attempt to drown out the sound of my own heartbeat. I spent 12 months in a silence I had once called boring. I worked as a freelance editor, fixing other people's stories while mine remained a jagged, unfinished draft. I never heard from Elias again. I never searched for Mark. Some ghosts are meant to stay in the fog. But on the anniversary of Elena Vance's death, a package arrived. It was a small, heavy wooden box, weathered by salt and age. There was no return address. No note. Inside, nestled in a bed of dried lavender, was the digital recorder. My breath hitched. I hadn't seen it since the night I left the Swiss clinic. I touched the cold plastic, my fingers trembling. I expected to hear the Morse code again. I expected the release message. Or perhaps, the recording of Mark's voice from the night he left. I pressed play. There was a long stretch of silence. Then, the sound of a door opening. Footsteps. The soft, rhythmic beep of a hospital monitor. It was a recording of Elena's final moments. But it wasn't the sound of death. It was the sound of Mark. Even without a voice, he was communicating. I heard the rustle of paper, the journal pages he had been filling for 6 years. And then, a sound I had never heard before. It was a hum. A low, vibrating melody, coming from deep within a ruined throat. It was distorted, raspy, and broken, but it was undeniably a song. A lullaby. As I listened, I realized what he was doing. He wasn't just comforting a dying woman. He was practicing. He was relearning how to exist in a world that had tried to silence him. The song went on for 10 minutes, a haunting, beautiful wreck of a melody that seemed to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. And then, the humming stopped. Sarah. I dropped the recorder. The name was a rasp, a ghost of a sound, whispered through vocal cords that should have been silent forever. It wasn't a call for help. It wasn't a plea for reconciliation. It was a statement of fact. He had found his voice, but he hadn't found it for me. The recording continued. Now, I heard Mark's voice, not the one from 6 years ago, but a new one, a voice that sounded like it had been forged in a furnace and tempered in the sea. It was deep, gravelly, and full of a terrifying authority. I am standing in the rain again, Sarah. But this time, I'm not running. I'm just standing here. The pie told me you looked for me. He told me you spent a fortune to find the man you broke. I want you to know something. You didn't find me. You found the version of me you created. The man you saw on that cliff. He died the night you cheated. The man talking to you now. He's someone you will never know. There was a pause. I could hear the wind of the Swiss Alps in the background. The money in the trust is gone. Elena is at peace. I've spent 6 years paying a debt I didn't owe to a woman I didn't know. Now, I'm going to spend the rest of my life being a stranger. Do not look for me again. Do not write about this. Do not turn my tragedy into your content. If you truly want to be sorry, then be silent. Let the world forget we ever existed. The recording ended with a sharp click. I sat on the floor of my quiet house, the recorder heavy in my hand. I looked out at the ocean, the grey waves mirroring the eyes of the man I had lost. I realized then what the break truly was. It wasn't that he hated me. It was that he was indifferent. He had achieved the one thing I feared most. He had deleted me from his story. I was no longer the protagonist. I wasn't even the villain. I was just a footnote in a chapter he had finally closed. I stood up and walked to the window. I opened it, letting the cold salt air fill the room. I took the recorder and held it out over the ledge. Mark was right. The only way to truly apologize was to disappear. I let go. The recorder hit the rocks below with a faint plastic snap, swallowed instantly by the rising tide. I watched the spot for a long time, waiting for a feeling of relief that never came. All I felt was the wind. All I heard was the sea. I walked back to my desk and looked at the blank screen of my laptop. For the first time in my life, I had nothing to say. I had no hook. I had no viral angle. I just had the truth. And the truth was a 5.000 word silence that I would carry for the rest of my life. I reached out and turned off the lamp. The room went dark. The story was over. And in the darkness, I finally understood what Mark had been trying to tell me all along. The most expensive thing in the world isn't a penthouse or a pie or a private jet. It's the peace of a man who no longer needs you to understand him. I closed my eyes and, for the first time in 7 years, I slept without dreaming of the rain.